The chamber was heavy with tension before a word was spoken, the kind of silence that carries history in its weight. Then came the voice that broke it, not with wisdom, not with patience, but with interruption. Jim Jordan leaned forward, cutting across Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence, his tone sharp, dismissive, and dripping with the kind of arrogance only power untethered from accountability can produce. He didn't wait, he didn't listen, he bulldozed. Crockett stopped, not because she had lost her train of thought, not because his words carried authority, but because she understood something deeper. Silence could slice sharper than any retort. Her eyes locked on him, steady, unflinching, the kind of stare that turns a room into a witness. For a moment, Jordan kept going, his voice rising in that familiar rhythm, part outrage, part theater, all noise, but the more he pressed, the more the room shifted. Staffers exchanged looks. Cameras zoomed closer. Every heartbeat seemed to drum louder, waiting for what came next. Crockett did not raise her voice, she did not flinch. Instead, she held the silence, forcing the weight of Jordan's performance to collapse under its own emptiness. The contrast was devastating, his noise against her calm, his bluster against her precision. The narrator's voice threads through the pause like a blade. He thought he could bury her with bluster, but in seconds she buried him with truth. Jordan's words faltered, a half-syllable caught in his throat. It was as if he realized too late that the more he swung wildly, the more he revealed his ignorance. Crockett, with the quiet poise of a seasoned attorney, prepared to strike not with anger but with fact, the kind that leaves no room for rebuttal. The audience watching at home felt it too, that anticipation of a storm about to break. On social feeds, clips of that stare would soon be looped endlessly, captions screaming about the moment Jordan finally met his match. And just as the silence grew unbearable, Crockett leaned forward, voice measured, deliberate. It was the calm before a demolition. What she revealed next would not just silence Jordan, it would leave even his own allies stunned. The silence had already unsettled the chamber, but silence was only the prelude. The clash between Jasmine Crockett and Jim Jordan wasn't just another tense committee exchange, it was a collision of two visions of America live in front of the nation. At stake was more than pride. It was about truth, dignity, and who gets to shape the narrative of justice. The setting itself carried weight. A House committee room, cameras trained on every twitch and gesture, reporters scribbling notes like battlefield correspondents. Here, words could become weapons and reputations could rise or collapse in a single exchange. Everyone in the room understood this, even if Jordan pretended he didn't. For Jordan, the committee was theater. He had built a career on volume, on drowning opponents with interruptions, on creating the illusion of strength by refusing to let anyone else finish a sentence. His power was in spectacle, not substance. But that very tactic, his relentless need to dominate the stage, was about to backfire in the most public way possible. For Crockett, this was different. She wasn't there to perform, she was there to defend the principle that law is not a game and truth is not optional. She had lived the weight of those ideals, built her career on them, and brought them into the room like armor. To her, this was not about trading barbs with a loud congressman. It was about protecting dignity itself. That's what raised the stakes. This wasn't just a spat between politicians, it was a referendum on whether calm authority could withstand weaponized arrogance. Millions of viewers watching from their living rooms weren't seeing an abstract debate. They were seeing their own experiences mirrored. The boss who talks over you, the neighbor who sneers at your background, the classmate who mistakes volume for intelligence. And in Crockett, they saw themselves not silenced, not pushed aside, but standing firm. The moment teetered. Every interruption from Jordan seemed more desperate, more frantic, like a man who sensed his grip on the room slipping. And every pause from Crockett built suspense, like the steady tightening of a bowstring ready to release. The audience felt it in their bones that something seismic was coming. Because if Jordan was allowed to keep bulldozing, the story would remain the same: the loudest voice wins. But if Crockett struck back with precision and unflinching control, it would send a message that echoed far beyond that committee room. The narrator's tone sharpens. This was not just another hearing, this was a test of whether arrogance could still bury truth or whether truth would finally silence arrogance. And that test was about to be answered in the most unexpected way. For the nation watching, it wasn't just about Crockett versus Jordan. It was about whether dignity itself still had a place in American democracy. What happened next would change everything. Before the silence, before the stare, before Jasmine Crockett sharpened her words into a blade, there was Jim Jordan, a man who had built his reputation not on mastery of the law but on mastery of disruption. To understand why his confrontation with Crockett mattered, you have to understand the man himself, his history, his tactics, and the arrogance that became his signature. Jordan entered Congress like a wrestler who had never left the mat, swinging elbows, grappling with opponents, and mistaking brute force for strategy. He wore his disdain for decorum like a badge of honor, bragging about refusing to wear a jacket as if breaking dress code was an act of rebellion instead of disrespect. To his supporters, it was authenticity. To others, it was theater. But underneath the bravado lay a pattern. In hearing after hearing, Jordan had made himself notorious not for insightful questions or sharp legal reasoning, but for turning every exchange into a shouting match. He interrupted witnesses, bulldozed colleagues, and manufactured chaos until facts were drowned in noise. He believed that volume equaled truth and that persistence equaled power, and too often it worked. This was not the first time Jordan clashed with legal minds who outclassed him. Prosecutors, witnesses, even fellow lawmakers had tried to check his aggression. Yet again and again he slipped past consequences. The headlines came, the clips went viral, but Jordan endured, insulated by the same arrogance that fueled his outbursts. To him, interruptions weren't bad manners, they were weapons. But arrogance always leaves cracks. In his quest to dominate the stage, Jordan revealed something dangerous, a lack of substance. When pressed for legal detail, he stumbled. When asked to cite precedent, he waved it away. When faced with real attorneys, people who had built careers in the trenches of the law, he defaulted to the same trick: talk over them, drown them out, hope no one noticed he hadn't done his homework. That's why this clash mattered. Crockett wasn't just another target. She was a lawyer, a woman who knew the law not as an abstraction but as a lifeline for communities too often ignored. Jordan's ignorance wasn't just embarrassing, it was a liability, and when he tried to bulldoze her, he wasn't just shouting over a colleague, he was exposing the hollowness of his own career. The contrast could not have been sharper. Jordan, the career interrupter, mistaking aggression for intellect. Crockett, the attorney, wielding silence and precision like instruments of justice. One saw the chamber as a stage, the other saw it as a duty. And yet, Jordan's story carried another layer, a cautionary tale of power unmoored from accountability. For years, he had evaded consequences. For years, arrogance had been mistaken for strength, but arrogance always meets its match. The narrator's voice cuts in, steady and foreboding. Every bully eventually finds the one they cannot intimidate, and every bluster eventually collapses under the weight of truth. The audience leans forward, sensing the collision that arrogance could not avoid. Jordan had walked into this hearing thinking it would be another performance. He didn't realize he was stepping into a courtroom he could not control, against an opponent who knew the law better than he ever pretended to. And that's why, in the silence after his latest interruption, the balance began to shift. Crockett wasn't just waiting to respond, she was preparing to expose the very weakness that Jordan had spent a career hiding. What came next would dismantle not only his argument, but the myth of his strength. Before that stare froze the chamber, before her silence cut through Jordan's bluster, Jasmine Crockett had already lived a story that prepared her for this moment. To understand why her words would land with such devastating weight, you must understand who she is, where she comes from, and why dignity has always been her sharpest weapon. Crockett's journey did not begin in the marble halls of Congress. It began in neighborhoods where law wasn't theory, it was survival. She grew up witnessing the gap between what America promised and what it delivered. That gap fueled her, pushed her toward the study of law not as an abstract discipline, but as a shield for people who were told they didn't matter. She became an attorney because she had seen too many voices silenced, too many lives derailed by systems designed to ignore them. In the courtroom, Crockett earned her stripes. She defended the marginalized, stood toe-to-toe with prosecutors, and learned the art of precision. Every objection, every precedent cited, every fact marshaled under pressure sharpened her instincts. She learned patience, the discipline to wait until the exact moment when the law itself became her ally. Unlike Jordan, who thrived on chaos, Crockett thrived on order, the kind of order that comes when truth is laid bare and arrogance runs out of words. Her rise to Congress was not an accident. It was the product of resilience. Campaigns where she was underestimated, rooms where she was dismissed before she spoke, headlines that tried to shrink her identity to a footnote, and yet each dismissal became fuel, each underestimation became proof that when she did speak, her words carried a force no one could deny. For her constituents, Crockett wasn't just a representative. She was proof that dignity could survive in the roughest arenas, that a woman of color with a legal mind honed in the trenches could stand in the very halls where arrogance too often reigned unchecked. She carried their stories into every committee, every vote, every debate. That's why her confrontation with Jordan wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It was every silenced voice finally demanding to be heard. Contrast defines drama, and the contrast here could not be sharper. Jordan, the career interrupter, wielding bluster like a club; Crockett, the attorney, wielding silence like a scalpel. Jordan mistook noise for strength. Crockett understood that true power comes from precision. And in that committee room, with cameras rolling and history waiting, those contrasts were about to collide. The narrator leans in, voice rich with gravity. Jasmine Crockett was not built in comfort, she was forged in fire. Every case, every dismissal, every doubt had prepared her for this moment. And when Jim Jordan tried to bulldoze her, he had no idea he was colliding with the sum of all that resilience. The audience feels it, not just admiration but pride. In Crockett, they see themselves: the worker silenced in a meeting, the immigrant dismissed in a classroom, the woman overlooked in a boardroom. They see what it looks like when patience and preparation finally meet arrogance head-on. And Crockett, poised in that chamber, was ready. She knew the law, she knew the stakes, and most importantly, she knew the power of timing. She didn't need to outshout Jordan, she needed only to wait, to let his noise collapse into emptiness and then strike with truth. That's why the silence mattered. It wasn't hesitation. It was the weight of years of preparation gathering into a single moment. A silence that said, "I will not be interrupted, I will not be diminished, and when I speak, you will listen." The narrator's tone sharpens again. He thought he could bulldoze her with arrogance. What he didn't know was that every interruption only built her case stronger. And when the time came, she would make the room remember her words long after his noise was forgotten. The audience leans closer, anticipating the clash. The hero is ready, the villain circling. The stakes have been set, the histories revealed. Now comes the collision. And that collision would begin with a series of interruptions that pushed Crockett and the nation watching right to the boiling point. The chamber settled into a rhythm that was less debate and more siege. Jim Jordan, eyes sharp with self-righteousness, lunged into his usual tactic: interruption. He spoke over Crockett not once, not twice, but again and again, each time louder, each time more desperate, like a man trying to plug holes in a dam with his bare hands. Crockett began each answer with composure. Her voice carried the cadence of an attorney used to being cross-examined, calm but unyielding. Yet before her second sentence could land, Jordan swooped in again, his words clashing against hers like cymbals struck too often. It wasn't dialogue, it was performance, a theater of bluster meant to overwhelm. Each interruption echoed like static across the room. Staffers shifted uncomfortably. Committee members sighed, some hiding smirks, others rolling eyes. The audience at home felt the frustration pulse through their screens. They knew this act. They had lived it. In workplaces, in classrooms, in family dinners where someone mistook volume for superiority. But Crockett's silence after each interruption was not surrender. It was strategy. She let him talk, let him run out his rehearsed outrage, let the cameras record every cutoff. Each time he broke in, she paused, steady as a metronome, making his noise louder by comparison. She didn't flinch, didn't rush, she allowed him to reveal himself. By the fourth interruption, the tension had become unbearable. The air carried a heaviness, like the room itself was tired of the performance. By the fifth, whispers spread among reporters: how long could this last? By the sixth, even allies of Jordan began to shift uneasily, sensing that the spectacle no longer served him, it exposed him. And then came the seventh. Jordan cut her off mid-word, his hand chopping the air for emphasis, his voice cracking with the strain of forcing dominance. It was meant to be the interruption that crushed her point, but instead it became the interruption that broke the illusion. Because this time Crockett did not simply pause, this time she leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed with calm fire, her posture straightened, and her silence stretched long enough to make Jordan stumble. The cameras caught it, the moment when his certainty faltered, when his performance cracked, when the bully realized the stage no longer belonged to him. The narrator's voice threads through like a drumbeat. 6 times he interrupted, 6 times she waited, but the seventh, that was the mistake he never saw coming. The audience watching leaned closer, breath held, knowing instinctively that something was about to give. Crockett had taken enough. The interruptions had become his own undoing. And now, with the room frozen, she prepared to deliver the counterattack that would not only silence the chamber, held its breath. Jim Jordan's seventh interruption hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid, clinging to every corner of the room. But this time Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for the noise to pass. She leaned in, eyes locked, and spoke with the calm precision of a surgeon making the first incision. "Congressman," she began, her tone measured, unshaken, "if you're going to lecture me on the law, at least get it right." The words landed like a gavel strike, sharp, final, irrefutable. Jordan blinked. For a split second he looked caught, a wrestler out of position, the ground shifting beneath him. He tried to retort, but Crockett was already in motion, each sentence a carefully constructed case, each phrase laced with the authority of someone who had lived inside the law, not just shouted about it from the sidelines. She outlined statutes, precedents, and constitutional provisions as if she were drawing a map that only she had the compass for. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The power wasn't in volume, it was in clarity. The room, once filled with Jordan's constant static, now pulsed with the resonance of truth. "You confuse opinion with precedent," she continued. "You confuse noise with fact, but in this chamber under oath the law doesn't bend to your interruptions, it bends to the Constitution. And Congressman, your ignorance of that fact is precisely the problem." A murmur rippled through the committee. Even those who had sat silent, arms folded, began to shift, eyes darting to Jordan then back to Crockett. The imbalance was obvious now. He was drowning and she was pulling the water higher. Jordan stammered, attempting to claw back ground, his voice higher, faster, betraying the desperation beneath the bravado. But Crockett didn't let the moment dissipate. She pressed forward, each fact layered atop the last like bricks in a wall he could not scale. "Let be clear," she said, holding up a document for emphasis. "You misrepresented the statute, you ignored the case law, and you've chosen theater over truth, but I didn't come here to play theater with you, I came here to defend the law you pretend to understand." The words sliced, the room erupted in hushed reactions. Reporters' pens flew across notepads, cameras zoomed tighter. This was the moment, the viral heartbeat of the hearing, when the bully's mask cracked and the hero's authority took full form. The narrator's voice swelled. With every word she stripped away the armor of arrogance. With every fact she revealed the hollow core beneath the bluster. And with every pause the silence grew louder than his noise had ever been. Jordan tried to interject again, habit, instinct, but now each interruption landed weaker, flimsier, as if even his own voice no longer believed him. Crockett didn't flinch. She raised her hand slightly, not to silence him but to command the space the way a seasoned litigator commands a courtroom. "Congressman," she said evenly, "you've mistaken interruptions for arguments, but interruptions don't change the law, and they won't change the fact that you've just exposed your ignorance of it." It was a mic drop without theatrics. No shouting, no dramatics, just fact delivered with surgical certainty. And in that certainty Jordan's bluster evaporated. He shifted in his seat, shoulders tightening, jaw clenching, the image of a man unaccustomed to losing control of the stage. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. It was the silence of realization, Jordan realizing he had no ground left, the committee realizing they had just witnessed a dismantling, and the nation realizing that arrogance had finally been checked. Social media would later seize on this silence. The clip of Crockett's stare, her calm voice against his sputtering, would be looped, memed, captioned, "This is what happens when facts meet bluster." But in the moment inside that chamber it was more than a clip. It was history playing out in miniature, the triumph of clarity over noise, of law over theater, of dignity over arrogance. And Crockett wasn't finished. She ended not with gloating but with principle, her voice lifting into the kind of resonance that carries beyond walls. "The American people deserve better than interruptions and misinformation. They deserve truth. They deserve leaders who understand the law they swore to uphold, and if you can't meet that standard, Congressman, then step aside for those who can." The words echoed, heavy, unanswerable. Jordan sat back, his face tight, his voice caught somewhere between indignation and silence. For once, silence won. The narrator closes the scene with gravity. He had interrupted her 7 times, but with one answer she silenced him for good, and outside the chamber the echoes of that silence were only beginning. Because what happened next wasn't confined to those walls. It would ripple outward, onto social feeds, into headlines, across a nation hungry for dignity to finally triumph over arrogance. And when the shockwaves hit, even Jordan's allies would be forced to reckon with what they had just witnessed. The clip spread like wildfire. Within minutes of adjournment, phones buzzed across the nation. Headlines lit up screens. "Crockett schools Jordan on the law," silence in the chamber, echoes across America. What had begun as another chaotic hearing had crystallized into something more, a moment of reckoning. Cable networks ran the footage on repeat. Anchors leaned in with that mix of awe and disbelief reserved for true turning points. Analysts called it a dismantling, a masterclass in discipline, the day the noise machine met its match. On the scroll at the bottom of the screen, Jordan's name appeared not as the aggressor, but as the humiliated, the man who had been outmaneuvered by precision. On social media, the reaction was volcanic. Hashtags trended within the hour. Crockett silences Jordan, low overlies mic drop moment. Clips of her stare, calm, unyielding, powerful, circulated with captions like "This is what leadership looks like" and "Interruptions don't change the law." Progressive voices amplified it as validation. Immigrant families, young activists, civil rights organizers, people who had long grown weary of grandstanding bullies, saw in Crockett a reflection of their own struggle to be heard, respected, taken seriously. But the shockwaves weren't confined to Twitter feeds and primetime reels. Inside Washington, even Jordan's colleagues could not hide their discomfort. Some stared at their shoes when asked for comment, unwilling to defend what had been exposed as bluster. Others whispered privately what they would not admit publicly. Crockett had turned his weapon against him. His interruptions had created the stage for his own unraveling. And then came the public. Letters poured into Crockett's office, thank yous, notes of pride, messages from young law students and community organizers who wrote, "You gave us hope, you gave us a voice." For every word Jordan had tried to drown out, Crockett's response now rang louder, amplified by a nation eager for dignity and truth. The narrator's voice cut through the montage of reactions. What Jordan thought was a show of dominance became a mirror reflecting his weakness. What Crockett delivered was more than a rebuttal. It was a reclamation of law, of truth, of dignity. The fallout reached beyond reputation. Strategists on Jordan's side scrambled to contain the damage, spinning excuses, dismissing the moment as grandstanding. But every attempt only highlighted the contrast. One side flailing with noise, the other standing firm in clarity. And in that contrast, the larger story emerged. This wasn't just about one exchange in one committee. It was about what happens when arrogance collides with truth, when power tries to silence dignity and fails. Crockett's composure became a symbol, a reminder that even in halls too often ruled by noise, there remains space for courage to cut through. By nightfall, the image was indelible. Jim Jordan silenced mid-interruption, Jasmine Crockett calm and immovable, and the nation watching, feeling the tide shift in real time. But beneath the praise and the headlines, a deeper current began to stir. Because moments like this do not end in applause, they ignite questions, spark new battles, force those in power to reckon with what comes next. And as the dust settled in Washington, the narrator's tone dropped to a low, suspenseful murmur. For Crockett, this was not the end of a moment, it was the beginning of a movement, and what followed would test not only her resolve, but the resolve of a nation watching. The chamber was empty now, but the echoes of what had occurred lingered, stretching far beyond the walls of Congress. Jasmine Crockett had not only silenced Jim Jordan, she had reframed the narrative. In one measured, precise, and unapologetic performance, she transformed a moment of confrontation into a lesson that resonated across the country. Dignity, knowledge, and preparation always outlast arrogance, noise, and bluster. Crockett's victory was not personal, it was symbolic. She stood not just for herself but for every voice that had ever been interrupted, ignored, or dismissed, for immigrants navigating systems that often overlooked them, for young professionals trying to assert their worth in workplaces dominated by loud, overconfident colleagues, for anyone who had been told to sit down, shut up, or step aside. Her calm authority demonstrated that power does not require volume, influence does not require intimidation. Truth, clarity, and persistence were far more formidable than any outburst. The narrator's voice weaves through the reflection. What happens when you stand firm in your knowledge, in your principles, and in your dignity? You don't just win an argument, you change the way people see what is possible. You create a blueprint for courage that others can follow. Social reactions reinforced the moral. Community leaders praised her poise. Civil rights organizations highlighted her example. Teachers shared the clip with students as a lesson in integrity. Her words became more than statements, they became an inspiration, a call to recognize that one's identity, expertise, and preparation could stand unshakable against intimidation. In practical terms, Crockett had reminded the nation, laws and principles are stronger than ego, truth is more enduring than spectacle, and character carries weight where bluster falls flat. The contrast between her and Jordan was no longer simply about who spoke louder. It was a lesson in leadership, responsibility, and the quiet, steadfast power of integrity. The chamber, once a stage for interruptions and chaos, now existed as a testament to the triumph of preparation over performance. Crockett's example reinforced a timeless principle: respect, knowledge, and composure are forces that ripple beyond immediate victories. They shape communities, influence policy, and inspire future generations. The narrator closes with a crescendo of clarity and inspiration. In that silence, she gave voice to millions. In that composure, she showed that courage need not shout to be heard. And in that moment, America was reminded that dignity, truth, and service will always outlast arrogance, noise, and ignorance. Her lesson lingers, urging viewers to reflect. In personal lives, workplaces, and communities, they too have the power to stand firm, to speak truth, and to claim space that others might try to silence. Crockett's example isn't just a political moment, it is a call to action, a moral compass, and a reassurance that justice and integrity remain worth defending. And as the story reaches its emotional apex, the suspense remains subtle but potent, because moments like this are never final. They invite replication, challenge, and continuation. The nation watched, learned, and waited for the next test of courage, knowing that the impact of Crockett's words would resonate far beyond that single hearing. Her triumph was complete. But the movement she ignited had only just begun. The dust had settled in the chamber, but the impact of Jasmine Crockett's words continued to reverberate. Jim Jordan's interruptions, meant to intimidate and dominate, had instead highlighted his own ignorance. Crockett's calm, precise, and unwavering response had turned a chaotic hearing into a historic demonstration of knowledge, dignity, and courage. The nation had watched, and the message was clear: truth cannot be silenced, and arrogance will always meet its match. For viewers, the lesson extended beyond politics. Crockett's example was a blueprint for anyone who has been dismissed, interrupted, or underestimated. It was a reminder that preparation, composure, and conviction hold power far greater than volume or bluster. Every interruption she endured became a stage for triumph. Every pause became an invitation for clarity to shine. And every word she spoke carried the weight of integrity, inspiring those who had long struggled to have their voices heard. This moment was more than a viral clip, it was a movement, a call to recognize the value of knowledge, courage, and perseverance in the face of intimidation. And it invited viewers to reflect on their own lives. Where can they stand firm, speak truth, and demand dignity? Where can they be the voice that breaks through the noise? If you believe that voices like Jasmine Crockett's deserve to be heard, that dignity should always triumph over arrogance, and that preparation and principle matter more than bluster, then carry this moment forward. Share this story, discuss it with your communities, and subscribe to stay connected to the conversations that matter. Be part of the movement that values truth over spectacle, courage over intimidation, and service over self-interest. Because moments like these don't end on a single hearing, they ripple outward, inspiring action, reflection, and change. And the next time someone tries to interrupt truth, the world will be watching.